or you can find it. Right, we are being recorded. So it's very nice to be here, and I'm very touched and moved that you invited me. Thank you very much. I hope I will be able to answer some of your questions and give you something which is useful, because that's my goal. And if anything is unclear, or if I speak too fast, which I often do, just stop me and ask me to repeat, or please ask questions, because it shows people are not asleep, given that it's very hard to be interactive on Zoom. So what Olga asked me to do is speak to you about B languages. This is a masterclass which I've changed slightly for you, hoping to reflect the Russian reality as far as I know it. But it's been my specialty ever since I've been an interpreter. I went straight from interpreting school many, many years ago to NATO headquarters as a staff interpreter. And as you probably know, at NATO, we work only with English and French biactively. So biactive interpreting with A and B has been my interpreting life for 32 years. And over the years, I've developed, I think, some expertise in teaching and practicing a B language. As you can see from the screen, my B language is French, my A language is English, and I have a C, which I never practiced with really, because at NATO there's no call for Spanish. So I've worked biactively all my working life. If I can get the slides to progress like that. There is a document available if you go to the website of this is the Cambridge Conference Interpreting course website, which you'll see on the screen. And if you go to that site and you click on the box marked texts, there are quite a few texts I've written on matters to do with interpreting, teaching and interpreting, one of which is on B languages. And so quite a lot of what I'll be saying is a development of that text. And by the way, just to a little page of publicity, the latest article I wrote, which is on the site, is a long article about get you home mode or degraded mode interpreting. It's about how to interpret when you can't do everything, which is often the case. How to speak concisely, how to summarize, that sort of thing. And that article, which is available through the link on the screen, also involves some recordings and some written examples of how to approach interpreting in degraded mode. That's what I call it. And if any of you read this article and have any questions, I'll be delighted to answer them, because it's my latest article. And I've tried to explain a technique which is very complex. That is actually communicating rather than just changing words. So moving on to the point of today's briefing, or whatever we want to call it. The slideshow is divided into three main sections. I've made the first section quite short because I think that in Russia, you all know why it's useful to have a second active language. I don't think you need to be convinced of that, given that the Russian market seems to be one of the most biactive in the world. The second part of my briefing is about defining what a B language actually is, because as a teacher of B languages and as a biactive interpreter in the international organization, it's quite clear to me that the actual vocabulary used by interpreters is not the same throughout the world, and people do not always understand the same thing with B languages or retour or biactive, that sort of thing, and bilingual. These are all rather vague terms, and one of my hobby horses is that most B languages are not good enough. And people say they have a B when they haven't really, and they don't give good interpretation in their B language, as they call it. And I think it's very important to start by defining what a B language actually is. When does a C become a B? Is there a difference between a B and an A? That sort of thing. And the last part of the briefing, which you'll see is 26 slides long, that is the part that some people think is the most useful because it's the most concrete part. It's about how do you actually go about acquiring a B language or improving it if you already have one, which I think is a lot of people do work on. And before we start, I ought to pay tribute to all of you in your practice group, the name of which I obviously can't pronounce because it's in Russian, because taking the trouble to actually train and to take time out from your busy careers and your busy lives to actually improve your interpretation, I think it shows you have a very good professional conscience. And as you're probably aware, most interpreters don't tend to do that. And I think this is a great tribute to you. So I congratulate you on that. Continuing professional development in interpreting to me is absolutely essential. I think if we want to call ourselves a profession, doing CPD as a constant thing is absolutely essential. Otherwise, we don't really have the right to call ourselves a profession. Moving on. Okay, let's make a couple of clarifications before we start. I hope it will become clear during my briefing that I feel not all interpreters can have a B language or should have a B language. It isn't absolutely essential to be an interpreter. It may be in Moscow, it is pretty much essential, from what I can gather. Moscow, I think, has a lot in common with cities like Rome or Paris, where 9/10 of all interpreters are biactive. And obviously, you know the reality much better than I do in Moscow, but I think it's virtually impossible to work as a freelance interpreter without a B these days. And we'll see why that obligation to have a B language can be very pernicious and very negative for our career, our reputation, if we say we have a B when it's too early. So the second part of what's on the screen here is that even though, to me, it goes without saying that not all interpreters have to have a B, most interpreters can develop a B. I think almost all, actually. Some, it's true that they start from too far away, but will never make it. But I think with a good initial assessment, this is what I've put on the screen, someone who knows what they're talking about, who can say, yes, this language which you want to make into an active language, which is not your mother tongue, is good, it's strong, you understand it well, it can become a B. And then if you get coached properly by somebody who actually understands that a B language is not an A language, nor is it a C language, and there's a specific way of using a B language, which not everybody necessarily understands. Given that you cannot say everything in your B, you have to approach it with intelligence and with modesty. So with the good initial assessment and a good coaching from a professional, most interpreters can develop a B. And of course, the bottom part of the screen is obvious. You know this as well as I do, that a B is always an asset. It's never a bad thing if it's a proper B. But I just said if it's a proper B, the more I interpret and the more I'm aware of the interpreting world, and the more I move within IEC, and I have many responsibilities in IEC and internationally, the more I'm aware that probably what I call bad or false B languages are a threat to our profession. Because for lots of reasons that we'll go into later, people often claim to have a B when they haven't really. And then the clients say, well, if that's what interpreting is in English, for example, we can do better ourselves, or our secretary can do that. So why would we pay all this money to have someone who says they're an interpreter speak bad English? So I know it doesn't apply to you, or you wouldn't be here. And I know how brilliant an interpreter Olga is, and I know how brilliant an interpreter those whom I know here are, Vera as well. So you really don't need that. But a lot of interpreters discredit our entire profession by working into a language they don't really master well enough. And we'll talk about that in a second. So let's move on to the first part of the briefing, if you're okay with that. Are there any questions yet at this stage? I assume Olga will just jump in if there are. Okay. Well, the bad news, well, the bad news in some ways is that in the conference environment today, customers are demanding clear and accurate communication. That's obvious. But at the same time, they also want cost effectiveness. They don't want to waste money. They want people to be able to work fast because time is money. And I'm sure you're all aware, because you live this day in, day out, that conferences are getting faster and faster. People have less and less time, and speakers are speaking faster than they used to. I actually go into this in my document on the website about degraded mode, talking about the increase in average speed of a speaker. A few years ago, 150 words a minute was considered quite fast. These days it's 200 or 220. So the world is speeding up, conferences are speeding up, and speakers are speeding up. Thank God for you, they don't all speak as fast as me. And so clients demand cost effectiveness, speed, and efficiency. And to that end, employing interpreters with a B language obviously makes complete financial sense. I won't spend much time on this because you know this already. This is what we in English call teaching our grandmother to suck eggs. Good luck with interpreting that. telling you something which you know already. So obviously, if you look at a typical NGO meeting involving English, French, and Spanish, which are the big NGO languages, and you look at the different costs between having 2 biactive booths and 3 monolingual booths, obviously it's a no-brainer, because we're talking about a 30% saving of money. This is something obviously which is much closer to home for you as Russian speakers. What we call in the West of Europe exotic or political languages, of which Russian is definitely one. Turkish is one, Chinese is one. These language interpreters working on the private market or the free market, they pretty much always have to be biactive, which of course you know full well, which is why you're here and why you asked me to speak. It's even more important for you because I was talking this morning, in fact, to a student of mine who is 18 and she's Russian, but she was raised in Belgium. And she really, really, really wants to be an interpreter. She's very, very keen. And I was saying you have to bear in mind that working with Russian can be high pressure, because Russian in the diplomatic environment, like a NATO, for example, is used as a tool. The interpreter is used as a tool as part of the international system of diplomacy. And very often diplomats in Russian diplomats or English-speaking diplomats speaking to their Russian counterparts will blame the interpreter for misunderstandings. I mean, I can see Olga is agreeing, and it's happened to all of us, I'm sure, but it happens more with Russian, Chinese, Turkish, all the difficult languages involving difficult relations between states. There, the interpreter does have a lot of stress to cope with. Certainly at NATO, I know interpreters who are Russian who don't want to work at NATO simply because the stakes are very high when we're interpreting, say, between the NATO Secretary General and Lavrov or Putin. And they will, it's part of the international game, and the language can often be a scapegoat. And that's difficult. So it does add an extra layer of pressure, certainly when working diplomatically. Obviously, as you know as well, I don't know if any of you work at the UN, but Russian and Chinese are the languages and Arabic as well, where the retour into a B language is required of the interpreters. The French don't do that, the English don't do it, the Spaniards don't do it, but the Chinese, the Russians, and the Arab speakers, interpreters at the UN are required to work back, usually into English, sometimes into French, but usually into English. And we'll talk about that as well, the difference between a French and an English retour for a Russian interpreter. This is another factor which I'm sure you experience this in Moscow or on the Russian market. More and more now, meetings are held in what delegates call English, which is not English at all. It's Globish, what the French call désespéranto, which is desperate Esperanto. And I'm sure you've also experienced the pain of trying to interpret people who are speaking Globish. But very often in that environment, meeting organizers do away with the English booth because they don't like to see interpreters being paid a lot of money and doing nothing, basically. Because as of course you're all aware, you can be in an English booth somewhere, a pure English booth, and open your mouth for 30 seconds in the entire day. Or not at all, because everyone else speaks English on the floor. So in those circumstances, very often the English booth is done away with as a cost-saving measure. And of course, in those situations, every interpreter present has to have a retour and a B, an English retour. I'm using the retour term, we'll come to that in a minute. So that's increasingly a phenomenon. It happens in medical conferences all the time. Very often there is no English booth involved. So all this is good news in that it increases the demand for good biactive interpreters, and I have put good in capital letters. But of course the bad news is there's a lot of competition, which in some ways should push all of us to try and do better in our B languages and actually have a true B rather than what you might call an imperfect or false B. Now, because all these things are individual subjective impressions that I have empirically from working as an interpreter for more than 3 decades. I know I'm right, but it's nice to have some figures to back up what you feel. So I sat down one day and looked at the IEC yearbooks between 2008 and 2017. And I looked for the percentage of interpreters in IEC who have 2 active languages, just to see whether the statistics back up what I empirically feel to be the case. And the figures I came up with are quite interesting. There you have the figures. The overall percentage of interpreters in AIC who have 2 active languages is 78%, and that includes AAs, which for the purposes of this briefing is the same thing, AA or AB. You're working into with a second active language. And here comes Julia. Vera is here. She won't see you though. Okay, Julia says hello to everybody. So if you look at the figures on the screen, you'll see that a lot of places like Milan or Munich or Paris or Canada as a whole, Berlin, these are places where 90% of interpreters have a second active language. The only exception to the rule on this particular list, I didn't put Moscow because there aren't enough AIC members in Moscow to make it statistically relevant. The only exception on this list is Brussels. Brussels, of course, having a 50% ratio of people with 2 active languages because Brussels is where the EU is, and the EU doesn't employ B languages, or very, very rarely. It's also quite interesting to look on the left-hand side of the screen. I don't know if you can see my cursor, the actual numbers of interpreters in different places of AIC members, which shows you that the 3 big cities for interpreting worldwide, at least among AIC, are Brussels, Paris, and Geneva. It was very interesting to have figures on the private market interpreters, because obviously the only organization that has statistics in a book or on a website is AIC. So it would be interesting to see what the figures would reveal of non-AIC members. I just took AIC as a sample of interpreters worldwide. So anyway, all that boils down to saying that most interpreters have a second active language, and therefore it is increasingly a requirement. So let's move on to the second part of the talk, which is about defining what a B language is. Are there any questions at this stage or not? I don't see anything in the chat, so I imagine we're okay. I'm either totally incomprehensible or very clear, one of the two. And I hope it's the second one. Thank you, Olga. I can see you. You may be thinking it's superfluous to define a B language. You might say, oh, we all know what a B language is, but no, we don't all know what it is. Because when I see the languages that are offered by interpreters as a B language, I think either they're being completely dishonest or they have no idea what they're talking about, because that is not a B language, for example, I will say. The trouble with the first problem is that vocabulary is not used consistently by everybody. So confusion reigns. Is it a bird? Is it a plane? No, it's a retour, maybe. It's biactive. It's a B language. It's bilingual. Which is it? I think it's fairly easy to get rid of bilingual to start with, because we all know that bilingualism is a bit of a red herring. I don't know if you know a red herring in English. It means it's a false argument, a red herring. It doesn't matter. I mean, you may be bilingual. I may be bilingual, who knows, but it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really have any particular application to the quality of a second active language, because you could be bilingual and you could be a terrible interpreter. And you could be non-bilingual and be an excellent interpreter. So I don't think that term is useful for us as interpreters. And we also all know, do we not, that people who are truly bilingual is extremely rare. It's very rare. A B language, now that's very clear. It's clear, at least in the interpreting profession. So if you're interacting with people who are interpreters, it's clear. If you say if I say to you I have a French B, you know what I mean. So it works very well among interpreters. It doesn't necessarily work with the outside world, because in the outside world, people don't know what a B language is, and why would they? It's our internal definition. Biactive is another term which is not used everywhere. For example, when I was at interpreting school, I went to, after leaving university, I was a policeman for 10 years. And after being a policeman, I went to interpreting school. And this was in the UK, in the city of Bath. And while I was there, I wanted to try and find some work when I finished my degree. So I wrote to lots of international organizations, including NATO. And NATO answered and said, we are looking for people with your biactive profile. And I didn't know the word. I never heard that word in my life. I thought they meant bisexual. And so I thought, I don't see what relevance that has to interpreting. But I then looked it up online. Well, online, there wasn't any online in those days. This was 1986. So there wasn't really much internet in those days. So I found out what it's supposed to mean, and I realized that it meant having 2 active languages. And it's a term we tend to use a lot at NATO. We say, yeah, we're looking for biactive interpreters. Do you work biactively? It's a word we use a lot. Is it the same in Moscow? Well, obviously not in Russian, but I wonder what term the Russians use. What do you use?
It's just kind of a norm of life. So what are your languages? It means to interpret between Russian and French or Russian and German.
Okay, so you don't really necessarily say be or biactive, or do you use the word retour?
It's, I think, only interpreters do use it, or conference organizers, customers, I think. For them, every interpreter is a biactive.
Yeah, okay.
They usually ask if we have, which pairs we have. And we say English, Russian, and that means that we do both ways.
Okay. It's interesting because it shows that in Moscow, it really is a truly biactive market. Because if you look at the IEC, the way in which IEC interpreters define their languages now, for the last 4 or 5 years, is through language pairs. We don't talk about A, B, and C so much. We have language pairs. And if you look at my profile on the website, or anybody else's profile on the IEC website, you have specific language pairs, but they're not all biactive pairs. For example, one of my pairs is Spanish-English. Another one is Spanish-French, but it's not a biactive language pair. It's just a language pair. So it proves that it shows that Moscow is a preeminently biactive city. The word retour, I mean, the top word on this list, I've used it a lot during this briefing already. It's a word the EU likes. There's even a concept in French, which the Belgian interpreting schools teach, which is called the retour dépannage. I don't know if you speak any French. Dépannage means getting you out of trouble when you break down, sorting things out. And what they're talking about is an emergency retour. And they're talking about the situation where you don't have a B language. Let's say, for example, you take my Spanish, which is a C. The Spanish interpreter dies of a heart attack. They have to go and find another interpreter quickly. And while they're looking, I jump into the Spanish booth and do very bad Spanish interpreting. And that's what they call the retour dépannage in French, which I don't agree with, because I think either you can do it properly or you can't do it, in which case you shouldn't do it. And I don't think it's wise. I think it's better to say the conference will now be suspended for half an hour while we find a replacement to the dead interpreter, for example. That would be better for the profession than throwing me into the Spanish booth, for example. Okay, moving on. As we have said before, as you know yourselves, people who are truly bilingual, so we're moving on from biactive now to bilingual, because there is often confusion, are very rare. Because to me, being bilingual as an interpreter means not only your language is perfect, you don't make mistakes in either language, but also you have the culture behind the language. So you've been brought up probably in both countries. That would be a requirement. Because I've met lots of Russian interpreters, for example, who have excellent English, brilliant English. I can think of 10 or 15 whose English is almost perfect, but they weren't raised in an English-speaking country. So a lot of the culture is missing, the culture behind the language. Because of course we all know, do we not, that language is not a thing that exists in a vacuum by itself. Language reflects reality. The way you speak, the things you say and the words you use reflect your perception of the world. So that's why true bilingualism, cultural, emotional, linguistic, functional bilingualism is extremely rare. And again, a red herring. So a true B language, and I put true in yellow to make it stand out, is obviously a second active language. That isn't hard to work out. To me, it goes without saying, but maybe it doesn't for you, that it should be usable in consecutive and simultaneous modes, because there are interpreters, many interpreters, in fact, who do not offer a B language in simultaneous, but only in consecutive. Now, that may be an acceptable position. I personally think it's not. IEC, for example, accepts it. But what it's saying is, because in consecutive I have time to choose my words, I'm not rushed. I can work appropriately into the second language if I have time to choose my words. Now, to me, that's saying I don't speak that language that well. And therefore, it would lead me to have serious doubts as to whether you can convey complicated and subtle ideas with the language tool, because you have to have time to find your words. And that, to me, does not go hand in hand with decent expression. So I don't agree with that. I think it has to be, your B has to be usable in sim as well. The IEC handbook, I'm not saying, I don't want you to get the impression that I think IEC is the be all and the end all, which I'm sure Valentin has worked out, and is a quote from Shakespeare, by the way, from Macbeth. I don't want you to think that for me, IEC is the be all and end all of interpreting. It's not at all. I'm simply saying it's a useful source of information, because the handbook exists as a website, and internationally it's available. So the IEC handbook says that it's acceptable for a biactive interpreter not to offer the combination C into B, which is another factor now. Now, I agree, there's no problem with that. For example, again, to take my own situation, if I couldn't do Spanish, French in simultaneous, I don't think it would make me a bad interpreter. I can do it, and I do it. But I think if I couldn't do it, it would not make me a less good interpreter. However, it would make me less useful to a customer. And the same holds true for the consecutive thing, like I mentioned earlier. So to me, if you can do CB, to me, it makes you a better interpreter, and it shows that your B language is strong, and it shows that your C language is strong. Because if you're saying I can't work from, in my case, Spanish into French, it's because the combined weaknesses of my Spanish and my French are so great as to make the product unacceptable, which means that neither my Spanish nor my French is much good, in my opinion. I'm speaking semi-humorously, but not really humorously. Hi, Valentin, I see you now. Nice to see you. So I think a high level B, and I assume that the reason you're here is that you want to have, if you haven't got one already, I'm sure you have, you already have a high level B. But a high level B and a B which you're going to continually improve should be active from your A and your C, or your C's. Now, obviously, it requires more skills, it requires more training, but that's what we're about as interpreters. But I don't necessarily feel you have to be able to offer C into B at the beginning of your career. I mean, that could be something which you acquire a bit later, in the same way that you might learn to do sim with text later. By the way, I have a whole masterclass on sim with text, which is a very important combination for me, a very important technique. This is something which I'm sure you're all aware of. Hi, Anna, excellent to see you. This is like a reunion. This is very nice. I assume you all know this, that when you're working at a high-level protocol meeting between ministers, captains of industry, but mostly in diplomacy, heads of state. I've done lots of heads of state meetings, obviously at NATO. It's what we do a lot of. There, you will only work into your B. So let's take the example, a personal example again. Let's take an example of me doing a bilateral meeting between the French president and the UK Prime Minister. God help me, I have no desire to be near Boris Johnson at all, but sometimes you have to be. I would work into French from Boris Johnson's English because I'm a British national. I'm actually also a French national, but let's say I'm a British national. So I would not work into my A. And Macron's interpreter would work from French into English, which is also his or her B. Now, the reason for that is that for reasons of diplomacy, you cannot be the voice of a country if you are not a national of that country, if you don't carry that passport. You're probably already aware of this. So in some ways, it's paradoxical, because you're going to have a really high-level bilateral meeting where the stakes can be quite high between two heads of government or two heads of state, and both interpreters are working into their B. So at that level, obviously, your B has to be pretty exemplary. I have a quotation here from a thesis which was written by a researcher in Belgium about B languages. It's a very short, well, it's quite short. There appears to be a general consensus that the notion of a B language is somewhat blurry. If an interpreter is expected to be perfectly fluent in the B language, then apart from perhaps a slight foreign accent, how exactly does the language differ from the interpreter's A language? What criteria have to be met for a language to be considered as a B language? Are these criteria ever circumvented for any reason? The question which needs to be asked here is the following. How could the notion of a B language be redefined so that a more detailed and clearer description could be given of what a B language is, or at least what IEC thinks it should be? However, redefining the B language in this way may prove to be extremely difficult, since there appear to be many different types of B languages. The word type here is used to refer to the different levels of language mastery that may come under the very broad heading of a B language. These different types may be a result of the market reality, perhaps a result of the high demand for B language interpreting, which then puts pressure on interpreters to have a B language, which may then result in people sponsoring others to work in the B language before they are really ready to do so. Now, this last paragraph here, I mean, first of all, she is a researcher, not an interpreter. She's using the word type, and she's quite right. There are hundreds of different types of B language, and we'll talk about that in a second. But this last paragraph here, I think, is very relevant to your situation. It's certainly something which I have direct experience of involving Russian interpreters in Western Europe. Let me give you an example of how the pressure to say I have, for example, an English B means people will declare that they have an English B when they haven't really, and they can't provide a sufficiently good interpretation in that language. NATO, again, it's my reality, so I'm talking about it, used to employ a lot of Russian interpreters in the good old days when we were speaking to Russia, and we're speaking to Russia a lot less now. In fact, recently, even the NATO-Russia Council meetings, which were the only environment where we were still speaking with Russia, was suspended. So that makes it even worse. Anyway, so if you take NATO's example, we used to hire Russian interpreters virtually every single day. Now, for many, many years, most of the Russian interpreters we hired were French B. Now, I'm sure I don't have to explain why that is. It's because, of course, after 1917, people fled Russia, and they fled very often to Paris, because French was the language of the court. France and Russia had to have this very strong link, like the transatlantic link between the US and the UK. And so that was where they ended up. And so many children of white Russians were raised in Paris. And there are a lot of Russian interpreters in Paris who are almost bilingual, pretty much. But their second language is French, it's not English. Well, it could be their first language, and it could be their Russian as their second language, which obviously often happens with children of immigrants. So we would hire these interpreters because there are many more in Paris than there are in Brussels. And we'd hire them, and they'd work back into French. And then the NATO staff interpreters, myself included, would take their French on relay and turn it into English. So that was how the regime worked. And then NATO decided, and I understand why, about 15 years ago, that they wanted all the Russian interpreters to work into English, because they wanted the majority of delegates to hear direct interpretation rather than relay interpretation. Because obviously at NATO, most people listen in English, unless they're French, or possibly Belgian or Italian or Spanish, possibly. And so it was decreed that the Russian interpreters who work for NATO have to have an English retour, or an English B language. And suddenly, overnight, every single Russian interpreter based in Paris discovered they had an English B. Whereas the day before, they didn't have an English B, they had a French B. And to be fair, most of them had very, very good French. And so then we started to hire the same people who suddenly had discovered they had an English B. And lo and behold, about half of them, their English wasn't a B language, it wasn't good enough, certainly not at NATO level. So we stopped hiring them. So this is a very good example of market pressure, putting pressure on people to say, yes, I've got an English B, we'll say an English B for now, when they hadn't. And that's what I was talking about at the beginning, which I think does a big disservice to our profession, because it means that people regard interpreting as not good, because they hear the B interpreting. Was that clear? I hope it was clear. It's clear to me anyway. Let's try now and look at my patented term. This is my own patented term, the B language continuum, because it's so hard to try and get a handle on where B languages sit. So this, I sort of put this together. Obviously, you can have your own version and you could change it. It's reasonably clear to me when you have a passive language, in my case, Spanish. You know, I know my limitations in Spanish. I couldn't work into Spanish, not properly. I could do it if I was doing liaison, whatever. Okay, so that's my C language. My A language is fairly clear. Although again, in my case, my French is pretty much an A as well, but let's say my English is slightly better. So I'm clear that I'm an English A, shall we say. Okay, that's not a hard thing for me to work out. Now, in the middle, you've got, this is all B language. Now, you could reasonably say that this is a B language here, and this is a B language here. But you can't say that this is the same as this at all, because the distance in quality between this and this is probably as big as this and this. I hope you can see my cursor, by the way, or my thises are not going to work. Good. So logically speaking, if you start at the bottom here, if you decide you want to acquire a B language, okay, you say, I need a B because that's the market requires, and I understand that people will not hire me, so I can work proactively. I'm going to work on my English, and I'm going to make it from a C into a B. So you start to work on it, and you improve it. And I do lots of coaching every day of my life, pretty much, coaching people with an English B. And some people say that the Cambridge course, which you may have heard of, which I am one of the directors of, is people look at it as an English B course. It's not really, but a lot of people come to Cambridge because they want to work on their English B. Anyway, so you decide to work on it and you say, I'm going to improve, I'm going to improve, I'm going to learn, I'm going to practice. You keep doing this and I'm going to shadow. And then one day you have to say, what was a C language has become a B language. Now, that's tricky. I mean, how do you know when that is the case? How do you know what a B language is? How do you know what the expectations of the market are? It depends partly on your market, your individual market, but there has to be somebody who can tell you, yes, you can start now. For example, yesterday I was teaching a young student who will qualify from the Morse University. She's actually a Kurd originally, but she's Francophone. And she's working on her English B now. She says, well, Chris, I can't start working and earning money as an interpreter until you tell me that my English is a B. I said, okay, well, I will tell you when you're ready. Yeah, but it's tricky. It's a big responsibility. And how do you know unless someone tells you? When what was a C language has tipped over into being a B. So it can be quite difficult. So I put a 5% difference here because there has to be some clear blue water, as we say in English, between a C and a B, obviously. So when you start working with a B, when it's not very strong, you're just starting, you can work on the private market at the entry level with the less demanding customers. You can do liaison interpreting, public service interpreting, that sort of thing. That's appropriate, I think, for a starter B. Then, because you're a conscientious professional and because you want to work better, and because you realize that doing something well is more fun than doing it badly, which I think is true for everybody, you continue to work on your B and it becomes better. So then you might reach here, which is sort of the middle of the B language continuum. Now there you can work for medium level private market customers, slightly more demanding, maybe negotiations involving lawyers, maybe business, maybe smaller international organizations, not big ones, not the UN, not NATO, not the Council of Europe, not the OECD, but smaller international organizations like the Railways Union in Paris, for example. And some of the bigger lobbies. In Brussels, there are some very big lobbies that have 9 or 10 staff interpreters with different languages. So you could work there. And then if you continue to work in your B language and you travel and you spend time in the country where that language is spoken, you get even better. Or it may be that you were born with a very good second language. In my case, I'm half French. My father was French. I spoke French as a child. And my French is almost, I say my French is probably around here somewhere. It's perhaps 2% less good than my English. So when you get to this level, then you can work for the big international organizations. you can work on government bilaterals, you can work on private market at the highest level. And that's when you've pretty much reached the ceiling of B language, because you can't make a B into an A, obviously. You can't say, I've reached here now, and the next step is to go here. But that's not going to happen, because it maybe sounds paradoxical, but you cannot make a B language into an A language. An A language is something which you possess or you do not possess. You can't manufacture it. But of course, the good news from that point of view is that you can manufacture a B language from scratch. So it's perfectly doable. So I hope that's clear. But I have another way of representing this B language continuum, which is, if I can get the slides to move, hang on, which is here. No, it's not. Yes, here. Right. That looks even more complicated. Basically, it's based on how many different configurations you can offer your client. So starting at the top, in this case, is what they call, in the EU, they call it a full booth, which means you can work into both your active languages from all your other languages, A's, B's, and C's. So if you can do, let's again take my example, not because I'm self-obsessed, but because it's easier than trying to work out what all your languages are. Here I'm working from English into French, French into English, that's not a problem. Spanish into French, into English, I beg your pardon, and Spanish into French. That means there is no combination between my languages that I cannot cover, except for working for C, which is not ever going to happen, and nor should it. So that means I can do 2 full booths, and you can do them in consecutive and simultaneous. If you go to the bottom of the ladder here, which is perfectly good, here you can do BA. So I could do French into English, and I could do Spanish into English in both simultaneous and consecutive. What I don't offer the client is Spanish into French, my C into my B, nor do I offer English into French in simultaneous. I only offer it in consecutive. So, and you can see in between, you're offering more and more stuff to your customers. So here you're excluding 2 things, here you're excluding 1, here you're excluding 1, here you're excluding nothing. So to me, it's just simple mathematics. It makes you a better bet to be hired by a colleague, but by an employer. Always assuming, of course, that all your definitions of your own A, B, and C languages are appropriate. Whereas if you're saying you've got a B and you haven't got a B, or not a good B, then of course all bets here are off. I hope that's clear, because that is the big space of confusion with B languages. I tried to get a handle on it. Okay, moving on. I take it, Olga, there are no questions. I see there are some chat things, but I haven't had time to read them. Are we doing okay?
Yes, I have a question. Is it, I don't know, are there any secrets of working from C to B? Because we had recently even some discussions about it, and it's a thing which is appearing on the Russian market, like working between French and English. Any recommendations about that, or any? So
you're talking here about you're talking here about working from a French C into an English B. Is that it?
I guess our markets, there are people, I think so, when people agree to do this, they have 2 B's. So it's more like
yes, that's
between B's then.
Yeah, well, that happens. Yes, it does happen. It's very rare. It's very rare, in my opinion, that people can do that appropriately. I know one person I know 2 people who do it. They're both German, and they're both German A with English and French B's. And for the first time at NATO, for example, many years ago, we actually tested one of these people working between 2 B's, because it was a configuration that we'd never even envisaged before. In fact, we had to do some out-of-the-box thinking to even get our heads around the fact that an interpreter working for NATO could work between 2 B's. And this person could. This person had 2 excellent B's. He was an excellent interpreter, and he still is. And it was possible, but it's extremely rare. Obviously, I'm not saying it can't be done. Of course it can be done. It's asking a lot, though. It's also asking a lot to have an A and 2 B's in the first place and keep them all up, keep them at an appropriate level all the time. because even maintaining 2 active languages is hugely hard. I mean, it's what I spent my entire career doing, trying to maintain my French and my English as an active language. But adding a 3rd one, I don't personally know how it can be done, but it can be done because people do it. But it's extremely rare. And any interpreter who comes to me and says, I'm happy to work between my 2 Bs, I would want to hear them first. I wouldn't take it on trust. What it boils down to, if you think about it, is the whole reason we have A, B, and C categories is because we have different levels of language mastery. And like I said earlier, if you've got 2 Bs which are not particularly brilliant Bs, if you add together the imperfections of the 2 Bs at the same time, to me, it's going to be very hard to have it actually to give your customer a product they deserve, because after all, they're paying a lot of money to have interpretation. And when you interpret someone, what you're saying to them is, you say whatever you like, and I'll interpret it. And people who are listening to you in a foreign language will understand what you're getting at. Now, if you're saying that, you have to be able to do it. And if you can't do it, it's just dishonest. I mean, I'm somebody who approaches life from a moral standpoint. And I think that if you say to your customer, let me put your message in my hands and it's safe with me, I will get the message across. And it matters to you, I'm sure, therefore it matters to me. And I can do it in this language and that language. If you can't do it, then you ought to get the money back. So the thing is, the customer can't always tell because, of course, they can't speak the foreign language. That's a matter of professional conscientiousness. But yes, it can be done. And as regards CB, that can be done. Of course, it can be done. I do it. My Spanish is not fantastic, quite frankly. My Spanish is a perfectly reasonable C, but it's not a brilliant C. But my French is a very good B. And I think that if you add together my experience of 30 years as an interpreter, my very good B and my average C, to me, in my own conscience, I can do a sufficiently good job if you add all those different criteria together. If I hadn't got one of them, maybe if I was a beginner with an average C and a very good B, that wouldn't be good enough. Or maybe if I was a very experienced interpreter with an average B and an average C, it still wouldn't be enough. So I think it's for each individual interpreter to assess whether, if you combine all the difficulties and all the plus points and minus points of that combination, can you offer a respectable product?
Thank you. Vera had a raised hand.
Hello, Vera.
Yeah. Hi, Chris again. Actually, I've been listening, and it's actually a very good question. Is there even such a thing as a C language in Russia? Because from what I know, like it comes from training. Like when I was at university, we were trained in any language you studied, you were supposed to do it both ways. Plus, like you mentioned that, oh, it's so strange when you offer consecutive, but you don't offer simultaneous. Like I graduated from Moscow State Linguistic University. Simultaneous translation was an extracurricular course you had to pay extra for. So it was not in the main, curriculum. So people who graduated, they were supposed to do consecutive only. If you wanted to do simultaneous, you had to do extra training. So it was not implied when you graduated.
That's
everything had to be, yes. Every language had to be biactive by default. So there is, from what I know, there is no, maybe it's emerging now, but from what I know, there's no such thing as a C language in Russian interpretation market. Everyone has to have a B.
That actually is quite interesting. I never heard anyone say that in those terms before, but from my experience of the Russian market, yes, it does seem to be true, actually. I don't recall many Russian interpreters talking a bit about the C language. Personally, whenever I see an interpreter or a school where the interpreter works between all their different languages, assuming they have more than 2, I'm always very, very skeptical, because to me, as an old-fashioned IEC interpreter who works at international organization level, that is unlikely to be very good. Schools that push their students to work into all their languages as active languages, the Italian schools do it a lot too. It's what the French call n'importe quoi. It's really how I interpret that. It's just being very slipshod, being very inefficient and unconscientious, saying that that'll do, it's good enough for the customer. Who cares, basically? And I think we should care. I personally approach my interpreting like I approach most things in life, and I do care. I want to do a good job, and you all do too, or you wouldn't be here. So whenever I come across a school that does that, and lots of schools do, I agree, pushes their students to work in every direction possible, right from the very start, that to me is a terrible school. I'm sorry to criticize the Moscow State University, and it's not fair maybe for me to do that, because I don't know your reality. I don't know the Russian market very well. Julia does, of course. But whenever I personally come across a school that does that, or an interpreter say, oh, I can work between any of my languages, I know that 99 times out of 100, the work they provide is going to be poor. And I have a lot of experience of that. So I think that we as a profession, we need to apply as much rigor as we can and be conscientious and say, I want to do a decent job, and I can't do a decent job in every combination. I certainly can't myself. And as regards the consecutive, that's very interesting, Vera. I had no idea that the simultaneous was actually an extra option, and that the basis was consecutive. I don't know, that wasn't that long ago, because you're only 9 years old now, so it can't have been very long ago. But to me, I don't know what the market again is like in Moscow, but all the markets that I know, consecutive is virtually non-existent these days. I did some recently for a job in Germany, and it's the first time I've done consecutive for about 3 years.
Well, you know, in the Russian private markets, there's less interpreters in total. Well, I mean, conference interpreters who do the simultaneous. Then there are AIC members in Brussels or Paris. So it's, you know, it's kind of small.
I mean, I'm very wary of trying to pontificate about your market, because I don't know it, and it wouldn't be right for me to say. But all I can do is speak about my own experience of the profession and my own experience of markets. But I don't have any direct experience of the Moscow market. But that was very interesting what you said, Vera. I shall ask Julia what she thinks.
Anna had a question.
Yes, since we all started this this reunion thing, I just wanted to add to what Vera just said. I've been feeling a huge pressure from the market these days, because from what I understand, many agencies went all the way to Europe and started offering their services in the European market, saying, okay, we can give you any pair that you want us to give you at a very low price. And I've been having many requests from agencies saying, well, you have a B and a C-ish, B-ish kind of language. You can probably do both ways. Like, well, no. And then you start feeling that you're kind of someone, like one of many other people who do agree to do that. And I feel, I don't know, like an Untermensch. I feel like an interpreter who is not able to do B to a B or B to a C or C to a B or whatever. And I don't know how my colleagues feel here, but I think it's an issue that we are experiencing now. At least I feel that as a full-time online interpreter.
Well, and, the fact, Anna, that you feel like an Untermensch means that you're actually an Ubermensch, because you have that conscience.
Possibly. So yeah, I just wanted to share that. And thank you for the question, Olga, and thank you for the answer, Chris. I feel I'm relieved now.
Well, it's not an answer, but I mean, again, it's a matter of conscience. I mean, we all come across this every day of our lives, don't we, as interpreters? Because you could do anything. You could claim to do anything you like, and customers may be happy with it. But would you be happy with it? You know, do you have requirements of yourself? Do you have a conscience? Do you feel that taking money from people and not providing the product that they're asking for is appropriate? I don't. But I mean, that's a personal matter. These are all personal matters. And of course, you said you're a full-time RSI interpreter these days, and a lot of us are. And the whole coming of RSI, or what I now call distance interpreting, DI is the term they use, it's changed everything. Because as you say, you can be called from Moscow to work in Paris online, or work in Timbuktu, or work in Bangkok, and maybe you are. And so the notion of this geographical market, which used to exist up until recently, for the time being, it's pretty much vanished. And that means that anybody can work anywhere, and many people will work anywhere, but they'll provide a very poor job. Now, there are two factors, aren't there, involved in that, if you like. There's the matter of individual conscience. Do I want to serve people decently, and do I want to provide a good product to people who are paying me money, and putting what's important to them in my hands, their message? Or do I only want to earn money, in which case all bets are off, quite frankly. But I don't think any of you are in that situation. I don't think any of you would do just anything to have money. A lot of interpreters do, it's quite true. And if you decide to play the conscientious card and say, I want to do a decent job, I'm going to apply certain standards, there are certain things I won't do because I couldn't do it appropriately, you have to know that you're then going to be fighting with one hand behind your back. But it's a choice you have to make at the outset of your career and the outset of your life, quite frankly. If you will do anything to further your ambition in life in general, whatever cost it might be to other people, you're one sort of person. If you say there are certain things I won't do because it wouldn't be right, you're a different sort of person. And so I suppose we are, as interpreters, as what we are as people. So shall we move on? Otherwise we're never going to stop this debate. But I agree, it's a conundrum, and I suppose every day you have to say, what does my conscience call for? And there is a third factor, like I mentioned earlier, I think, which is, I don't know how you feel about this, but I feel that doing anything in life well is fun. Doing it badly is not much fun. That's why I want to be an excellent interpreter, because I want to do what I will do really well. It's a lot more fun. Coming out of the booth and thinking, oh my God, I did a terrible job today, I just about survived, it was really awful. That's no fun. Okay, let's move on to the next bit. Okay, we don't have to talk about that now. It's not that. Okay, let's look at a few characteristics now and criteria for helping to define a B language. And then we'll move on to the third part of the talk a bit later. What we could do, Olga, maybe is have a 5-minute break before the third part so people can pee.
Yeah, sure.
But we're not there
make
yet.
A break.
We're still in the second part now. So when we get to the third part, then we can do a quick 5-minute break. Because Julia always tells me that I have to have breaks for people because apparently people are human and they have certain requirements and stuff.
Yeah, what you're saying is very dense. We need some time to process it. Okay,
so a few characteristics and criteria enable you to say this is a B language, this is not a B language. I want to be clear about one thing during, in fact, all this briefing. Every time you make a mistake in a language when you're interpreting, every time a customer who's listening to you hears you make a mistake, it damages their confidence in you. It's inevitable. It has to. So the whole concept of working into a B language is in itself, some people contest the whole idea of working into a B. Some people say you shouldn't do it because it's never going to be good enough. I don't agree with that at all, because the intelligent use of a B language is a perfectly appropriate way of interpreting. You might even say that if you work appropriately and intelligently from an A into a B, you can do a better job than somebody who's working into their A who's a bad interpreter. But you have to have the knowledge of how to use a B language, what things you can attempt with it, what things you can't attempt, not trying too hard, keeping it simple, deverbalizing, not trying to use words that you don't know, hoping you'll get them right, using words you do know, that sort of thing. But we'll come to that in the third part. So all I'm saying is that I should perhaps have said this right from the very start, that every time you make a mistake, a linguistic mistake in your B language, or every time you pronounce a word so badly that it can't be understood, you take, for example, the French. Most of my coachees are French A, English B. And the French A's tend to mix up the pronunciation of the word to live, as in I live in Belgium, and to leave, because their vowels are incorrect. So a French person will say, I leave in Belgium. But that means you're leaving Belgium in Belgium to go somewhere else, presumably. So I don't know what that means, I leave in Belgium. If I correct and say, oh, I think that he or she means I live in Belgium, then it becomes clearer. But if you're asking your customer to rectify your interpretation in that way, if you're asking me as the customer who's paid 800 euros for my interpreter for the day, to say, oh, I just heard the person talking about leaving Belgium, but I think they must mean living in Belgium, given the context. I'm doing part of your job for you, which means I should give you should give some of the money I've just paid you back to me, because you're asking me to do 10% of the interpreting myself. So all I'm saying is that if a B is not brilliant, it damages client confidence at all times. Okay, when you're working from your B into, if you're working from your A into your B, you don't have the same intuitive understanding of the language you're hearing or producing as you would with your A. But if you're working from your A, you have this bonus whereby you understand everything that's being said without effort. So you should use that bonus, because it means there's much more bandwidth of your brain being freed up working from your A, which you understand without any real effort. And you can devote that bandwidth to either the interpreting and or the actual production of the B language. I'll come to that in a second as a model. I have a model for that, which I'll show you in a second. So you use what could be deemed to be a disadvantage to your advantage. I understand my A really easily. My B is not perfect, but because I can devote almost all my brain power to actually understanding the argument and then producing decent B language interpreting, I end up winning out, because I'm using so little brain space to understand my A. So in your case, if you're working from Russian to English, Russian, you don't have to exert conscious mental effort to understand Russian, I assume. But you do have to exert conscious mental effort to produce good English, because it's a B. But you can, because you don't need to devote the effort to the original. Then we have the question of the accent. Now, the question of accent is quite a problem for Russians speaking as an English A, because I find Russian accents, it's not I can't understand them, they annoy me. And if it's a typical Russian accent like you get in a film, some evil Russian spy speaking in a James Bond film with a Russian accent, it's horrible. I mean, I just hate it. And so even if I could understand it, I just don't like it. It's annoying me. And if your delegate is annoyed, they're going to be wasting energy being annoyed rather than listening to what you're saying. So to me, reducing your accent is a very important thing to do. It also improves your credibility, because every time I hear a Russian, well, let's not even talk about articles. That's another problem, of course. This is an example. This is Inspector Clouseau in the film, the Pink Panther film. Do you have a room? I don't know what a room is. Zimmer. Ah, a room. And all the poor fellow is doing is asking for a room. And so accent is tricky. Accent is very tricky in a B, because it's very hard to get rid of. It's often the last thing that you can get rid of. Sometimes you can't get rid of it at all. I personally recommend you do a lot of shadowing to reduce accent. Accent coaches work for some people. I have experience of them. Not myself personally, I haven't used one, but lots of my students go to accent coaches, and some find them useful, some don't. I mean, actors use them and singers use them. So if you find a good accent coach, it may be helpful. But to me, the prime tool for improving your accent in your second language is shadowing. But you also need a native speaker to listen to your shadowing. Shadowing with the text in front of you helps, because that way, if you get a sound you don't recognize, you can see what word it is. So shadowing without the text is less useful. Shadowing with the text is a very useful tool. And the accent, who can say when the accent becomes a real problem? If we have this thing with the leave and live, if we have the French saying, I have a good idea, as the French all say, when they mean a good idea. Now, I can work it out. I know because they're French, they're saying ID when they mean idea, but they didn't say idea. So again, it's me having to do part of the job for them, that sort of thing. It's tricky. The English, for example, working into French, again, I have to quote languages that I know, they mix up the U in French and the OO in French. So you have this sound U and OO, and the English get them mixed up. So they do them both, but at the wrong time. And it really, really gets on my nerves, that does, as a French almost A. Another very good example of a French speaker in English is the or sound, broad, law. They can't do it. They go broad, low. Now, if I hear someone saying low, which means not high, and I think they mean law, which means the law, I'm having to rectify again. So some delegates can rectify because they understand, some can't. Some are prepared to make an effort and some aren't prepared to make the effort. They're going to say, find me a new interpreter. And you can't blame them because they're not paid to rectify your interpreting. Moving on from the accent question, that's a very complicated, the accent question. So a slight foreign accent is acceptable in a B. I think everyone would agree with that, as long as the accent doesn't introduce ambiguity. Because the whole reason that people are going to pay you money to interpret is because they need an unambiguous message. They need people to understand what's going on. And if your actual interpretation introduces ambiguity where there was no ambiguity, then you're actually, not only are you not being good, you're being positively bad. And you're possibly damaging the message rather than simply not improving it. And that to me is not acceptable. So if your foreign accent introduces ambiguity, then it becomes a problem. If as Russians, your misuse of the definite and indefinite articles introduce ambiguity, which they can, then it becomes a problem. If you say, for example, the foreign policy is not right, that means one thing. If you're referring to Russia, you presume it means Putin's foreign policy. If you say foreign policy is not right, that means the concept of a foreign policy is in itself a problem, and that's two different things. So that's an example where the Russian problems with articles introduces ambiguity, and you shouldn't really be doing that. But I've almost given up now trying to get Russians to understand articles because I don't think you can. I don't know how it works in Russian. Perhaps you don't have any articles. I have no idea. But the actual end result is just a soup. And if I ever get a Russian interpreter who actually gets them right, I think, yes, that is a proper interpreter. That person really does have a B language. So maybe as Russians, you ought to be laying stress on the articles. Now, we're talking about accent still, right? Now, not only is accent not necessarily a huge problem, but it can actually be an advantage. Now, let's look at that for a second. Various employers of interpreting have done surveys. NATO has, SKIC, the EU has, the OECD, IEC, we've all done surveys, and we do customer satisfaction surveys. And we say to the customers, what's important to you? When you hear an interpreter, what's important? And they consistently say that they want accuracy and terminology being correct, that they want consistency. So you say the same thing for the same thing all the time. And every member of the team says the same thing for the same thing. Otherwise, you really are introducing ambiguity. You know, if each interpreter has their own version of a term, that really screws up the comprehension completely. They also say they like a good, nice quality voice and decent delivery. So no, none of that, because that sounds horrible to the customer. So all these things are deemed by consumers of interpreting to be far more important than foreign accent. And that is the case consistently. So maybe you shouldn't be too obsessed with accent. It's not the end of the world, as long as it's comprehensible. You can go even further along these lines and look at this. For example, if you take the BBC as an example of a broadcaster, they actually use actors who are reading from a speech delivered by, let's say they have Putin. Putin's making a speech about hypersonic glide weapons, which he often does, by the way. And they will have his speech being read on radio, obviously not in Russian because no one understands Russian, by an actor who is simulating a Russian accent. Now, the reason for that is that people listening think it's more authentic if the speaker has an accent, because they say, oh, he must be a Russian or she must be a Russian. Therefore, you can guarantee what they're saying is going to be correct because they understand the Russian. If you had somebody who was totally bilingual, who was reading a Russian speech in English and had a perfect BBC accent, people would think, well, that person sounds like an English person. Therefore, how good can their Russian be? Because the average consumer doesn't understand that some people can be bilingual. So in some ways, actually having an excellent accent can play against you. Let me give you an example of that. One of my coaches, one of my main students, in fact, who's a very good young interpreter, she's 30, she's been interpreting for 2 years now, recently took the NATO test. And she is French A, English very good B. She's almost bilingual. Her accent in English is perfect because she's half English. Now, she failed the test because they said her English wasn't good enough, which is funny because her English is extremely good. What they were saying is, I think, that her accent was perfect. Therefore, the minute there was the slightest mistake in English, they couldn't process it because she sounded like an English person. Whereas had she had the same number of mistakes in syntax and grammar with a little bit of a French accent, I'm pretty sure they wouldn't have minded that because it was being clear it was a B. So to an extent, having a perfect accent, for example, can actually play against you if it's a foreign language. So it can be advantageous to have a bit of an accent. People will cut you some slack. People will expect the odd mistake. It sounds weird, and it wasn't fair in my opinion. I don't think it was a fair result that she got from the exam board, because I know her interpreting very well. But that's human reality. People are people. A small number of errors now. How many errors can you make in a language? Syntax, grammar.
Excuse me, Chris. Could I ask a question, please?
Yeah. Who's that, please?
It's Valia. It's Valentin.
Hi there. Hi there.
I'll have my camera on. On the topic of accents, recently, a customer of mine, a client of mine, told me that we don't want the interpreters to have the British accents, standard Southern British, because, well, nobody likes the Brits. Is that true? What do you think about this whole situation with the British accent, general American accent, and the Globish or the EFL accent?
Well, thank you. That's actually quite. It's good to hear that everyone hates the English. What you should do, if we're talking about English now, the English you need to speak if you want to actually be a good interpreter serving lots of customers is a neutral English. Now, whether or not they hate the English, these people you mentioned, is another matter. Maybe they hate the English accent rather than hating the English people. I have no idea. But it's true to say that most people, when they learn English, they learn American. Because, in fact, some people say you shouldn't call it English anymore because the percentage of people who speak English who are English is tiny. You know, it's almost infinitesimal. It has no bearing on the way in which the English language is evolving in the world. I don't know whether you know this, but 2/3 of people who speak English in the world are not English A's. So the fate of the English language is more in your hands than mine. Because I personally, as a Brit, I have no real influence on how the language evolves. And most people who learn the language learn American. Whether they know it's American or not is another matter, but they do. And it's true that there are some ways the English have of pronouncing words which only the English understand. So if you're pronouncing a word in a very English fashion, in the same way that if you use cricket terminology, I can start talking cricket terminology now, you wouldn't understand a word I'm saying for 10 minutes, not a word. I'd understand it and another English person would understand it, but no one else would. So, you know, am I communicating? Am I fulfilling my contract? Well, no, of course I'm not. In the same way that if I spend my time quoting Shakespeare, which most people don't understand, I might have fun, but I'm not actually being a good interpreter. I'm not getting a message across. So I think you should avoid anything which only appeals to or is understandable to a minority of customers. You have to have an English which what the French call passe-partout, which will pass anywhere. For example, if I say a lorry, okay, I don't tend to say lorry at NATO because the British word for a truck is, as you probably know, a lorry. But no one understands that. Only the Brits understand it. So I say truck. I hate it because I like English and I don't like American. But I have to say it because I am paid to communicate. Another good example, which may not be exactly what you're talking about, Valentin, it may not be the accent, it's more vocabulary. There's sometimes you have to make a mistake in English to communicate because people don't learn English, people learn Globish. So if I say, well, the question of a foreign accent in B language is a real showstopper What am I communicating to you? Well, seeing Valentine's on the screen, what do you understand by that? If I say the concept of a foreign accent is a real showstopper, what does that mean to you? Not saying much.
Understand it. Not much, really.
Okay, well, a showstopper for the average Globish speaker, a deal breaker, yeah, that's right, exactly. It's a bad thing. People think, it stops the show, therefore it's probably a bad thing. Okay, now that's how 95% of people in meetings understand the term showstopper. But a showstopper, originally, actually it's an American term. It comes from American musical comedy, and it was the main song, the best song in the whole musical. It was so good that everyone stopped and said, "Wow, listen to that!" And that was a showstopper. So in proper English, a showstopper is a fantastic thing. It's the best thing there is.
That's why it didn't mean anything to me, because, I understand the showstopper exactly in this way, coming from the musical, like the centerpiece of it. But I couldn't connect the second part to the first part of what you were saying. So it made no sense in the context.
Yeah. So, again, if I use showstopper when I'm in the booth, in the British sense or the American sense, the proper sense, I'm not actually doing my job, because my job is to communicate. And I'm not paid to be right, I'm paid to communicate. It helps to be right, and it's nice to be right. But in that case, you have to subjugate your ego to your mandate, which is to communicate. Now, to come back to your question about people hating the English accent, I don't know, did they mean the accent, or do you think they meant the culture, or do they just mean they couldn't understand it?
The way my client put it was that nobody likes the Brits.
Oh dear.
That's why you need to tone down your intonation. Well, my accent is far from being perfect, right? And it's not English in the way I would like it to be. But still, they told me to tone down that and make it sound more Russian, or make it sound more neutral.
Well, that's possibly a different question. Maybe they didn't understand your English because it was too good, which is also
no, they did. The way they put it was that nobody likes the Brits.
Okay,
that's why we don't want the interpreter to sound British.
Okay, mind you, can't blame them with Brexit. The Brits are so stupid.
Would you say that any of the variants of English is more comprehensible than others?
Yeah, well, it's what I was saying in response to your question initially. You have to have, if you're going to speak English in the booth, it has to be English that's comprehensible to the majority. Now, any regional accent is not. If I take a Cornish accent, a Yorkshire accent, a Louisiana accent, a Texas accent, these are all regional accents, and they're all less comprehensible than standard English, standard American English, or standard British English. So I think it's incumbent upon you as an interpreter, if you're going to be working into English, to have English that is as neutral as possible.
Okay.
Let me move on, so otherwise we're not going to get finished, because we've got an hour left, and I've got a long way to go yet still, unfortunately. I'm going to have to speak faster. That was a joke. Okay, to come back to the idea of errors, how many errors can you make? Now, that is completely impossible. You can't answer that question. It's what the English call saying, how long is a piece of string? How long is it? Don't know. There are certain errors that are more important than others. For example, I talk to you about, as a typical English speaker, I cannot stand the Russians making mistakes with the articles all the time. The and a, or not the and not a, it drives me mad. But that's just me. The French, for example, are driven mad by my mistakes with genders. It's almost like a visceral thing. I mean, I'm sufficiently French to feel that. And if people make mistakes with genders, I cannot help but correct them. It's just something which the French do all the time. And so those sort of errors you have to avoid, because they will drive your customers mad, and you aren't paid to drive your customers mad. In English, the big problem is tonic accents. Is it development or development? Is it luophilie or loophole? There are certain tonic accents which foreign speakers tend to get wrong a lot, which drive English speakers crazy. But most mistakes are okay. Let's say, to give you an example, and I'm trying to put a handle on something that you can't really describe here. If I take the NATO test as an example, okay, we test interpreters for about 30 minutes doing simultaneous interpretation, 15 minutes into their B, 15 minutes into their A. In the A language, you assume there are no mistakes in grammar or syntax. In the B language, if during your 15 minutes of interpreting, under pressure, because it's hard interpreting, you make 6 mistakes, that's just about okay. That's probably going to be the limit. 6 grammar or syntax mistakes. If it gets to be more than 6, we start to think, well, that's not going to do the job. That's not good enough. Our clients will not accept that. So it's just an example. Yeah, it's impossible to say because some mistakes are worse than others, but it is to give you a vague idea of where the standard lies. And I appreciate this is the NATO standard, which is a very high standard. Yeah, we are very demanding. So the private market is a lot less demanding. I have students whom I'm coaching who are working every day biactively English and French, and their English, quite frankly, is not very good in my opinion, but the market accepts it. So we have to work out where the standards of the market are as well. Let me move on. Another factor about the quality of your English is that given there's this massive rise in the world today of Globish, as we've been discussing, of Desesperanto, where people say showstopper when they mean the opposite, that sort of thing. They say dependable when they mean dependent, that sort of thing. These are mistakes that people make a lot in Globish. Very often, the only people who actually speak proper English in a meeting is going to be you, the English Bs. So your English B needs to be as good as you can make it, because you, by speaking English correctly in the booth and everyone hearing you, you can actually raise the level of the whole meeting. You can raise the level of the debate by applying proper English. I mean, I'm sure you've all had the situation whereby the delegate repeats exactly what you've said. And it's very gratifying, isn't it, when they use your vocabulary and your turns of phrase. And yes, you go, yes. And in that way, you're raising the game. There's a saying in English, which you may have heard, a rising tide floats all boats. So when the tide rises, all boats are raised up by the water. So if you can inject good English into the meeting by speaking good English in the booth, people will start to listen to you and they'll start to use that good English, which will then raise the level of the debate. So very often you'll be the only people there speaking good English because there'll be no English speakers there. So this is a big responsibility, which I hope you will carry with sufficient gravitas. This is something I said before. Listening to any interpreter working into a B, making mistakes of syntax, grammar, accentuation, music, is always tiring to an extent. So you're always asking something of the customer. So bear that in mind. One easy way you can compensate for this is by having a nice voice, an agreeable voice, training yourself to have a voice with good inflection, which is agreeable to listen to, and that will compensate for a lot of the mistakes you make. You can take for granted you'll make mistakes, because we all do in our B languages, but work on something which is easy, like voice quality. You can work on that. You can listen to yourself. You can do voice classes, and you can improve the timbre and the quality of your voice, and you can maybe lower the volume and make it sound more agreeable to listen to. That can compensate. In our native language, we say what we want. That's your A. In an acquired language, we say what we can. And that is both a good thing and a bad thing. In your B, you can't say everything, but like I was saying to you earlier, be aware of that and use your B intelligently. Don't try too hard. And very often the customer will be very happy to have simpler terminology and to have complicated ideas made simple, if you're capable of doing that in your B, because they'll be grateful too. It makes it easier for them too. So what's easy for you is also easy for them. So it's win-win. This is a quote from the film on Hannah Arendt, who you may know, the famous musician. Hannah Arendt speaking English is like she's playing the fiddle. If you want to hear her play the Stradivarius, you should learn German. Difference between the B and the A. If you speak to a man in a language he understands, it goes to his head. If you talk to him in his language, that goes to his heart. So again, if you're doing a meeting which is very emotional, where we're talking not about something objective, but something subjective, you have to have the linguistic tool to touch the heart of people. And that can be hard in a B. It can be hard to have the register of emotion and pain and anguish and euphoria and joy. And I recommend that you practice interpreting speeches where the emotion is very high, to get the inflection in your voice, to get yourself able to speak English, to touch people's hearts, to arouse emotion. I often use speeches with my students in French, this is generally, of people making funeral addresses, funeral eulogies. I have several of President Sarkozy, for example, talking to the families of people who have been killed in action, soldiers killed in Afghanistan, because there are lots of words linked to grief and joy and pain and anguish and comfort. And having all these registers in your B is really important. Otherwise, you can't touch people's hearts. Okay, that's okay. Okay, so this is the last bit now, the third bit. So shall we have a 5-minute break now, Olga? Would that be a good idea, do you think? So it's now, to me, it's 25 minutes to 5 my time. Should we come back at 22 in 7 minutes time? Would that be okay for you?
Yeah, 7 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, so what do I do? Do I leave the recording on or stop it or what? What do I do?
Oh, just 7 minutes. It's okay to leave it on, I think.
Okay, so I'll see you in 7 minutes time.
See you.
Don't go away.
Thank you.
How is life? Somebody, how are you? Dasha, hello. I think everyone speaks Russian. Я не могу.
Не можешь? А кто у нас главный?
Крис.
Ну да. Подожди, ты как хост, ты можешь рулить записью.
Точно вижу.
Ты можешь на паузу поставить.
Паузу.
Are we recording? Yeah, okay. I mustn't forget that we're being recorded because I mustn't say anything like I normally would say. That is not for public consumption. Okay, so I had actually thought we could finish with a bit of an exercise, but we're not going to have time because I have 3/4 of an hour left and we come to the meat of the briefing now. Never mind, we'll do one next time. I hope this is, I know this is not practically based, it's more a masterclass, but I hope it's answering some of your requirements. So let's move on now to the third part, which is about how do you actually go about acquiring or improving your B. This is the part that Julia always says is the best part because it's actually concrete stuff rather than me just talking. Before deciding you want to make a B out of a language, in your case, most of you, I assume, or all of you, it's going to be English, I would say there are certain conditions that have to be met. Otherwise, it's not going to be a realistic exercise. The first one is that your A language has to be fine, because obviously, if you're going to devote time to working on your B, a lot of young interpreters find it's a problem because they start to work really hard on their B and they forget about their A. So obviously you have to keep your A working at the same time. And you can be an interpreter without a B, but you can't be one without an A. So don't forget that. I would say that if you want to make, say, English into a B, it has to be pretty good to start with before you start the training process, because otherwise it simply isn't a realistic option. Yeah, you might be able to make any language into a B if you spend 20 years doing so, but is it actually a realistic option for a working conference interpreter? So your English has to be not very weak, and it helps if you have no accent or very little accent. Then you can start on that basis. More preconditions which you may or may not have thought of. The first one I would say is that you need to spend some time. I put 9 to 12 months. That's the criterion that the Paris schools apply, for example. They will not let you work into a second language until you've spent a year in that country, in a country where that language is spoken. So I don't know whether that's the case for most of you, all of you, any of you, but it helps massively because there are a lot of things that you will not pick up unless you're in the country. Very often things like pop culture, which we'll talk about in a minute. And the second criterion, or these two basically are linked together, is that you have to be ready and able to work like a mad person on the B, because working into a B doesn't just happen. You can't just say, oh, okay, I've got good English, I'm going to make it into a B. Yeah, that's a nice resolution, but it takes a long time to do. It takes many hundreds of hours of practice, guided practice, not just practice anywhere or any old how, but proper guided, targeted practice. You may or may not know, you probably do know this, that when you actually learn to interpret simultaneously, your brain changes shape, literally. This was the title of a BBC program some years ago, and they did CAT scans of people who started interpreting school and people who finished interpreting school. And the brains had all changed shape considerably, because what happens is to do simultaneous interpreting, you have to create certain synapses, certain neural pathways that don't exist naturally. So when you learn to interpret, you create these synapses and then you become able to interpret. But that only works one way. So if you take, for example, the way you're working from English into Russian, you can't just take those neural pathways or what you've just learned and apply it en bloc, apply it in one go to your working from Russian into English. You have to do the work again. Not all of it, but probably 2/3 of it. You have to relearn to interpret. You'll make the same mistakes you made originally working into your A, and you have to iron out these mistakes, and you have to create new neural pathways. And it takes time. You simply cannot do it overnight. In the same way that when you go to a gym, you can't suddenly go from lifting 30 kilos to 100 kilos in one day. You could try, but it'll probably kill you. So it takes months, and it takes months also to learn to work from an A into a B, because the brain is not yet ready for it. And along with all this, you have to replicate a good part of what you did originally at school. The way in which you learned to interpret, you're going to have to learn to interpret again into your B. Some of what you learned before can apply, but most of it can't. You have to put in the time doing the work. What form should the training take? Well, let's look at a few learning strategies. The first one, which I really strongly recommend, and I have a document on this too on shadowing, which you'll find. Oh, I got to plug my computer in. Hang on, it's about to run out of juice. You will find my document on shadowing along with the other.
I think Chris has disconnected.
Yeah, I hope he's coming back. He's out of battery, so I hope he will be with us. Oh, we can't hear you.
Am I back now?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, sorry about that. My computer gave you about 1 second's notice before turning itself off. Sorry.
No problem.
So we were talking about, yes, shadowing. So the document which I wrote on shadowing, you'll find with the other documents on the CCIC website. Because shadowing is not quite as simple as you might think. It doesn't just entail repeating what the speaker's saying. That's part of it. There's a lot more to it than that. I won't go into the whole thing now. I'll just give you a couple of ideas. While you're shadowing, first of all, choose what sort of native speaker you're going to shadow. Are you speaking British English, American English, Australian English, New Zealand English? Not Russian English, please. So choose a native speaker, and yeah, it's probably going to be a very personal matter which sort of English speaks to you more, or which sort of English you've been exposed to most, because you can't really have, say, a British accent and American vocabulary, and you can't have American accent and British vocabulary. It doesn't work. They have to go together. So choose your version of English. I'm not going to say one is better than another. I wouldn't dream of saying that, although Julia's not here anymore. Experiment when you're doing shadowing. This is your chance to experiment. Experiment with different time lags. Spend time shadowing 1 word, 2 words behind the speaker, which pushes you into having a lot of linguistic agility. I personally am somebody who works with only 1 or 2 words lag. I like to work right up there with the speaker. But of course, you can't do that unless you've got a lot of linguistic flexibility, because you only have 1 second to find the word. So you have to have a lot of flexibility in your working language. You should be able to do it in your A, but it's not always easy to do in your B when you first start. To me, I suppose the fact that I work with such a small lag behind the speaker is because I've worked for more than 30 years in an environment where it's very technical, it's very dense, it's very fast, and it's the only way to survive. It's the only way to get the content. So experiment with different time lags. You can try a very long time lag as well. You can try a 5-second time lag, which to me is too much, but it's an experiment you can use to get your brain to be able to retain 5 seconds of buffer before you're producing your English. Then with the shadowing, what you should be doing is gradually introducing your own expressions into the shadowing. You might say, I'm going to change 1 word per sentence. I'm going to change 2 words per sentence. I'm going to change every other word. I'm going to change all the words I can. So you make the speech more and more your own. And then the most important thing when you're shadowing is doing this, starting to introduce multitasking exercises. I assume you can work out the reason behind this. So while you're shadowing, write down prearranged numerical sequences or songs or poetry that you know by heart. I should have put in here that you know by heart. So it has to be things that you know already. And I assume you understand why you're doing this. The reason you're doing it is to get your brain into the situation where it can speak proper English in the booth using only part of your mental capacity, because your mental capacity should be reserved for understanding the idea and actually explaining the idea. It shouldn't be used to produce the language. That should go without saying. It doesn't go without saying when you first start with a B, but it should be second nature. So what you're doing here is forcing your brain to do something else while you're speaking. Then what you do is record yourself, obviously, to listen to whether your English is appropriate and check the accuracy of these things here. Were they correct? And when your English sounds good and your other jobs you're doing with your brain are accurately accomplished, then you're starting to get the situation where you have a B. And you can start to interpret into that language and think at the same time. Because obviously it goes without saying that the interpreter who can't think and talk is at a big disadvantage. So you're supposed to do both at the same time. Is that clear? Because it's a very fundamental concept. And then we get to the stage here where your proficiency linguistically in syntax, accent, and grammar is sufficient to get the job done, even when your mouth is on autopilot. And until that happens, you haven't yet got a B. I remember when I trained at school, and I still remember the day when it happened for the first time, when I recorded myself, and my French, because I was working into my French B, was actually okay. I thought, yes, at last, now I can start to interpret. But until that time, if you're making many mistakes, you're not ready yet in the B. Because after all, your brain should be engaged in the higher function of actual processing the ideas. You shouldn't be devoting your brain space to speaking correct English. That should go without saying. There's an image I use because I'm a NATO interpreter. If you like, the idea that you're getting across, that the speaker is conveying, is like the nuclear warhead. Okay, so the idea is a nuclear warhead, but the nuclear warhead is no good to anybody if you can't get it where it needs to go. So if you're North Korea and you want to attack the USA with your nuclear warhead, you've got to get the nuclear warhead to Washington, DC. So for that, you need a delivery system, which is the missile, the ICBM. So the language here is the missile, which delivers the nuclear warhead, which is the idea, into the ear of the customer. But the language is merely a delivery system. What matters is the idea. It's not about the language, it's about the idea. Obviously, you know this for your interpreters. Try and not fall into this trap, which a lot of people fall into and working into a B, which is they're channeling a lot of energy into the language and not into the meaning. You should find a way to produce your language simply, use simple syntax, short sentences, not try too hard, and we'll come to that in a second, because if you try too hard, you will fall flat on your face, and it will be at the expense of the actual content, which is what you've been hired to transmit. You haven't been hired because you speak good English. Everyone assumes you can do that. You've been hired to understand the ideas and transpose them into the other language so your customers can understand you. That's why they hire you. And it will not occur to the client that you can't speak English or French or Greek or whatever the language might be, because they assume you can. This is one way of explaining this attention split between B and A and B. I have two ways of doing it. This is my own particular personal way, and this is the usual way. So usually we say working from B to A, okay? You're devoting 70% of your mental effort to understanding the B and 30% to reproducing the A. It could be 80-20 or 90-10, depending. In the other direction, you're only using a minority of your mental bandwidth to understand the original. It might even be 5% if it's very easy and it's your A language, but you're devoting the major part of your effort and your mental bandwidth to producing the B language. So it swings and roundabouts. Another way of looking at it is the analogy of a tire. You may or may not know that I do race driving or rally driving. In fact, I should just say that I won my class recently in a Haye d'Antibes in the south of France. I'm now about to go down to the south of France again for a rally in the Var. Anyway, I do car rallies, right? And when you rally, you have tires. The tires are really important. Now, with your tire, you can accelerate and you can brake and you can corner. And you can combine accelerating and cornering or braking and cornering. But however you combine the different tasks that you ask your tire to do, you can't go beyond the ability of the tire. And your brain is the same. Your brain has a certain amount of ability today. Let's hope that in 2 months' time, it'll have more ability because you're going to be training every day, and every day your brain will improve in its ability to work. But you can't do more than what your brain is able to do, but you can split the tasks up into understanding, speaking, listening, that sort of thing. So it's up to you how you split your attention up, but only within the overall envelope, which is the overall ability of your brain today. But that can change. It can change every day if you train. A second learning strategy is something which is really, really fundamental. The way in which you relate to the world, the way in which you think of basic concepts of your humanity was all formed in your brains when you were at school, probably when you were between 10 and 13 years of age, somewhere around then. That's how you relate to the world. That's how you calculate, it's how you count, it's how you repeat the months of the year to remember how many days there are in a month. But you didn't learn them in your second language. Unless, of course, you were in the lucky position of going to school in both languages, which is often a recipe for bilingualism. So all this stuff you have to replicate now in your second language. And it's not easy, it takes time. One very good way of doing it is to buy school books from that language. So we're not talking here about the high philosophy, we're talking about the basic concepts of how you relate to life in your own language. And you have to have those concepts in your second language as well. But it doesn't happen naturally. So I would say buy school books. If it's English, buy school books that are used in the US or the UK, and say, oh, that's how they calculate quadratic equations. That's how chemists express themselves in English. That's how a physicist or mathematician works, because you have to be able to say all these things in your second language. The fields we're talking about, which are going to be lacking in your knowledge, in your B language, are more or less these. Far and away the most important one is this one. This is something which trips up every B language interpreter: geographical terms and geographical place names, country names, capitals, mountain ranges, rivers, all these things. And it's complex. If, by the way, you're interested, I did record for my students here in Belgium every country in the world in English and how it's pronounced. And if you're interested, I could send you the file. It's just a sound file. But it's something you won't know instinctively because you didn't learn it at school. It's not part of your psyche, so you have to learn it. And the only thing you can do is learn it. There is one little hint I can give you about the English language as regards country names. The English language will tend to keep the original language. So if, for example, we're talking about the island of Trinidad and Tobago, it's Trinidad, which is the Spanish, and Tobago. If we talk about Nova Scotia being Latin for New Scotland, that was the way the country was originally christened. The French, for example, will make it French. They won't keep the original language, that sort of thing. So if you're not sure, if you repeat it in the original language, if you know what the original language is, you're probably going to be right. But you're never going to know them all. Mythology, history of art, all these things you did at school and didn't do in English, literature of all sorts, mathematics, because you have to be able to say the square root, cubic meters, all that sort of thing, fast Fourier transforms, mathematical expressions that you don't know in a second language. Chemistry and physics, again, you're going to be interpreting chemists and physicists. You have to have this basic terminology at your fingertips in your B language. And until you learn it, you don't, because you didn't learn it as a kid. Obviously, once you've achieved all this knowledge, you have to keep it up to date. I think Elena raised a hand. I'm seeing this, but I'm not sure if anyone's looking at the chat at the moment. Elena, did you raise your hand?
Yes. I have a question. When you listed these topics that are useful for every interpreter, we were advised also to pay attention to military terminology and to the Bible, because there are a lot of quotations, metaphors, terms that came into the language from these two areas, and also sports.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because one of my masterclasses is about the Bible, and I have another one about Shakespeare, and I have a third one about sports. So yes, these are all very important topics. And you're quite right. I probably should add them to this list. Sporting terminology, especially take the Americans, for example. The Americans are incapable of speaking without using sporting terminology, and they're also incapable of putting themselves outside their own culture and trying to work out what words, like a Hail Mary pass or a Monday morning quarterback, these sort of terms, how many people outside the States understand these terms? It's basic terminology for an American. Do you know what a Hail Mary pass is, for example? It's used a lot. Does anyone know what it is? Well, a Hail Mary pass is when you're playing American football and you pass the ball and you make a prayer. You say Hail Mary, hoping to God that it'll reach someone on your own team. That's a Hail Mary pass. So it's doing something which is unlikely to work and praying it will work. And for example, a Monday morning quarterback this is American terminology, is somebody who second guesses the game on Monday morning when the game is finished, which is equivalent to saying it's easy to be wise after the event, or hindsight is a wonderful thing. That's what being a Monday morning quarterback means. In English, we use cricket terminology. If I say I'm playing on a sticky wicket, or that was a bit of a googly, unless you understand what I'm talking about, you can't possibly interpret it. Or playing with a straight bat, or playing off the front foot, or being on the back foot. These are all terms from cricket, which are used a lot in British English. So you're quite right. Yes, sporting terminology is really important. And Shakespeare, well, the Bible, very much so. In fact, when I do my Bible masterclass, both in Cambridge and separately, and if you want it, I can provide it to you. The Russians are always very good at it, because the Russians, I assume that the Bible plays a big important part in your schooling in Russia, because the Russians always seem to know a lot about the Bible, which is good. To me, it's good anyway. Moving on, obviously, like I said, once you've acquired all this knowledge, you need to keep it up to date. You know, that does not go without saying. It requires spending time doing so. I also think that it's much easier to learn stuff from a film than by reading a textbook. If, for example, you take nuclear deterrence. Now, nuclear deterrence is a big topic in today's world, sadly, and it's becoming increasingly important. I've been, as you know, I've been working at NATO for more than 30 years, and nuclear deterrence has been important all the time, but in the last 5 years, it's got more important because, unfortunately, the world is a very unstable place. And yeah, we're not all friends in the world these days, and there are other countries like Iran and North Korea acquiring nuclear deterrence. So the concept of nuclear deterrence is very important to understand, but it's quite academic. Whereas if you watch a film like Crimson Tide in English, or Le Chant du Loup in French, if you have French, it's a very graphic, a much more fun way of learning about nuclear deterrence. If you look, for example, at the film Dr. Strangelove, I don't know if any of you know that it's a film from the 1970s. Stanley Kubrick made it. Brilliant film. It's called Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. It's a brilliant film. And so all these things explain the logic of nuclear deterrence. For example, it's much more fun to learn it through a film than reading a book, I personally find. One thing which is really important in your B is to cover all the registers. The thing is, when you learn a B, often in a school, they talk a lot about the high register, about the Financial Times, Le Monde in French, The Economist. These are all very important things. You should read The Economist, you should read the Times. Yeah, I agree. But those are not the things that most people read in a culture. They tend to read things of a more popular nature, like The Sun in England, or The Express, or the News of the World when it existed, that sort of thing. And if you don't understand pop culture, then you can't really interpret. And if you don't know the terminology in your B language, you can't use it. For example, Harry Potter, yeah, what terms are used? Game of Thrones, what are the terms that are used in English? Luckily, these films were all made in English, so you probably know the terms in English already. So it's a lot easier for you if English is your B. But these are examples of pop culture that you should be up to date with in both your languages. The Star Trek, Star Wars, Twilight, Peanuts, The Matrix, new film just come out, by the way, in The Matrix, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, The Hunt for Red October. That sort of, this is again about new missile submarine technology, for example. The Gunners, or the COP, which are football crowds. And let me give you a couple of examples of pop culture which was used in meetings, which I've heard in NATO in the last couple of years. So the first one was an example where an American technician was trying to explain how the Americans train their fighter pilots. And he was pointing out that it's expensive to train fighter pilots. And so what they do now is use a lot of simulation. I'm sure you're aware of that. Simulation is employed very widely these days to train all sorts of people. Grand Prix drivers too in Formula One. They also train on simulators. And he was trying to explain how it all worked. And he said, basically, it's quite simple. It's like the Star Trek holodeck. Now, if you don't know what that is, you can't interpret. I assume you do know what it is. It's where the crew on the Enterprise go to have R&R, rest and recreation, when they have time off. And it's a holodeck where they have holographic adventures. This one is a good one too. This is actually used to describe the relationship between Russia and the US. And the speaker was saying, well, the relationship between Russia and my country is like peanuts. Now, what he meant was that in the Peanut comic strip, continually over the years, the girl, is it Lucy? I think her name is Lucy, isn't it? I can't remember now. I think, is it Lucy? If someone knows, correct me. And Charlie Brown, who's the guy, she puts a football down and he comes running up to kick it. And the minute he takes his foot back to kick it, she takes it away and he falls flat on his back. And she's been doing this to him for 20 years and he hasn't learned yet that she's going to do it. So he's saying that's what Russia does with America. They keep changing the goalposts. They keep moving the goalposts. We think we know where we stand and suddenly the whole thing's changed again. That's what he was saying. So again, if you don't know what peanuts is, then you can't really explain that. This one here, does anyone recognize this reference to My Fair Lady? My Fair Lady is a film that was made of the George Bernard Shaw film book, or play rather, Pygmalion, where there's a language professor takes a woman from the gutter in London in the 19th century and teaches her to speak like a countess. And he has a bet with his friend. And so a delegate was in the room and they were drafting a document in English. And they were asking him, because he was the only Brit, the only English speaker in the room, can you make sure that the English is correct here? And he said, don't look at me to check the drafting. I'm more My Fair Lady than anything else. What he meant was, I'm more the woman from the gutter. My English is not very good. That's what he meant. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, I'm sure you understand that one. Robert Louis Stevenson, the very famous novel. And in this case, they were referring to a delegation that would change its stance. I think it was a Turkish delegation. On one day, they'd be really friends of this idea. The next day, they'd be completely against it. And so he's saying, are you talking today as Dr. Jekyll or Mr. Hyde? Which one are you today? Are you the good cop or the bad cop? And this one, if any of you got French, it was in a financial meeting, and he was saying this document is basically an unidentified financial object, a UFO, not an flying object, financial object. And then he went on to say, and the truth is out there. So what he was saying was the document is completely opaque. I can't understand a word of it. The truth is probably there somewhere, but I can't find it. So these are two references. The first one is to the idea of a UFO, which I'm sure you know. And the second one is the tagline from the X-Files. I don't know if you ever watched the X-Files, but the subtitle of the X-Files was "The Truth is Out There." And that was the French version. So yeah, examples of pop culture. Moving on again, a third strategy to learn your B language and to improve it. You choose an outstanding speech in the target language, in this case, English. Again, make sure you choose your American or your UK version and memorize a sentence from this speech every day. Obviously not good morning, that doesn't really count, something slightly longer than that. You don't have to remember the whole speech. You can get rid of the first sentence on the second day and learn a second sentence and keep repeating it to yourself hundreds of times that day until it becomes completely second nature. If you're interested in doing this, and I recommend that you do it, I have a list of links to speeches that you could use, good English speeches, which are also good to shadow from. So if you want it, Olga, I can send you that document with links if it's interesting, useful for your audience. A fourth strategy, this one is a very, very useful one that I use a lot with my students. It's flexibility exercises, linguistic flexibility. So what you do is you take a document, a speech, or it could just be a document rather than a speech, and you reformulate each sentence 4 or 5 times using different vocabulary, different syntax, different grammar, passive or active voices starting at the end, starting in the middle, but you have to do it fast. You have to do, in a B language, I'd say 4 or 5 versions instantaneously. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Don't give yourself an hour. That doesn't count, because that will go against the whole point. The whole point is to push your brain into digging deep into your linguistic reserves and finding solutions. And in your A language, you can do it in your A language too. You should be able to find 7 or 8 versions in your A language. And some people like to do it in a group as like a game. You come together, 3 or 4 of you, and you see who can find the most versions, or you work together to find 10 versions. You get where I'm coming from? I hope you do. The idea being that when you're in the booth, working into English, if your knowledge of the language is limited, you're not going to find a solution immediately to every single idea. But if you have 5 possible versions in your head, you might find 1. If you've got 2 versions, you might find 0, which means you're going to dry up. So it's pushing your brain into being flexible and digging into your reserves of language knowledge. This one is a basic one. Obviously, you go to museums, you go to exhibitions, you go to sporting and cultural events. That's pretty obvious in your B language country, if you can. This one is one which is, again, is a basic one. It's one that I used at university back in the Stone Age. Every time you hear a good phrase or a cliche, cliches are really, really useful. An image, a metaphor, a neologism, write it down and learn it. I'm being quite quick now because I've only got a quarter of an hour left. Now, there are some general considerations now of things you should avoid doing in your B language, things that people do frequently, and it's a mistake to do so. Bear in mind, first of all, that each language which you take as a B, and I think we're talking about English here, has certain specific difficulties which will trip you up. In English, it's going to be emphasis, it's micro pauses, it's tonic accent, it's irony, sarcasm, where of course where an English speaker will say the opposite of what they actually mean. And if you don't know the language well and you can't replicate the tone of voice, you're going to end up saying the opposite of what you should be saying. So those are the big traps with English, I'd say. It's the cadence of the language, the music of the language. I wanted to finish with a short exercise about that, but I'm not sure we're going to have time. We'll see. Pay great attention to register. The register in a B is massively important because it's really easy to make mistakes in your B and to offend people. And you lot, particularly working with Russian and English, because you can be part of a diplomatic game where relations are often strained. Any mistake you make with register can be taken as an excuse for one of the delegations to either walk out or become aggressive, or to feel dissed, to feel disrespected. So you've really, really got to be careful with register. And the example I have here is actually from a Russian interpreter whom we were testing at NATO. And this is a very good interpreter. I know him well. He's very experienced. He's a very capable interpreter, but he tends to be a bit slipshod, a bit flexible with his register. And we were having him interpret a goodbye speech by an ambassador to other ambassadors. And where the original in Russian was, ladies and gentlemen, or my dear colleagues, he said guys. And you cannot have an ambassador calling other ambassadors guys. It's not acceptable. And he actually failed the test because of that one word, because everything else he did was pretty good. But we said to ourselves, if he's capable of thinking, if he thinks that is an appropriate word to use among ambassadors, he's going to offend a lot of people. And we can't allow him to be in the booth offending people. So just one word can be enough. This is a quotation from Shakespeare, obviously, King Lear. Striving to better, oft we mar what's well, which is the best being the enemy of the good. So keep it simple. Don't try and blind your customers with your brilliance in a B language, because usually you'll get it wrong. So keep it simple. Avoid the temptation of sprinkling your interpretation with pretentious, old-fashioned, or unusual usages. It can be fun to do. Yeah, we all like to do it. But generally in a B language, you get it wrong. In an A, you can probably do it. But in a B, unless you're very, very certain you're going to get it right, don't. For example, I was training this young interpreter this morning, and we were doing a speech by Emmanuel Macron in Ouagadougou, in Burkina Faso. And he was saying, for those of you who understand French, l'Afrique est un continent qu'on doit regarder dans les yeux, which means in French, Africa is a continent we have to look straight in the eye. And my student said we have to look Africa in the eyes, with an S on the end. Now, it's understandable, but it's wrong. And so the net effect of trying to use a nice expression, look in the eye, if you get it wrong, is actually negative. So she was trying to look to impress the audience, but all she was doing was the opposite. This is an example which still remains in my head from one of my first meetings at NATO, working with a colleague who was French A, English B, and the French delegate was saying, well, off the cuff, if you ask me here and now, I can't really give you a proper reaction. And in French, it would be à froid. If you take me cold, he was saying. And my colleague said, well, I can't answer you cold turkey. Now, as I'm sure you know, cold turkey doesn't mean when you're taken by surprise. Cold turkey means when you're coming off a drug. When you're going to go cold turkey is to wean yourself off a drug. So the word cold was nice and it was a nice turn of phrase, but it wasn't appropriate. That's another example. Here we have a quotation from the Bible, just to suit, I think, Valentin. Use not vain repetitions as the heathen do, for they think they shall be heard for their much speaking. Now, this means that very frequently in a B language, because you can't find exactly the right word to convey the idea, you add 5 or 6 words, hoping that one of them will get close to the right word. And the problem is you're just confusing the audience, you're just confusing your customers and making your own life harder, because it means you've got to say a lot more stuff. And the more you say, the less communication there is, because you haven't got time to actually use inflection, pauses, etc. And that's one of the topics of my document about the degraded mode, by the way, that I mentioned earlier. It's about saying less to convey more, communicating by using fewer words and pauses, emphasis. So don't use lots of words, try and use 1 or 2 maximum, but try and make sure that those words are close to where they should be. Working out of your B language, working out of your A, obviously you understand what's being said, like I said before, but it's no guarantee that you can actually convey in your B what you've understood in your A. So you think because you understand it, you can then easily express it in English, in this case, if that's your B, but you can't necessarily. The fact that you understood it doesn't mean you have the linguistic tool to convey what you've understood with equal ease. And that's why a lot of interpreters say to me, I prefer to work into my B than my A. What they mean is they understand very easily what's being said, and they aren't checking their output. They think that they can convey everything they've understood, but they can't necessarily. That is more or less it now. We have 5 minutes. Let's quickly go around. So if you all turn your mics on, I want you to read part of Edgar Allan Poe's